Dr. Sarah Whitehorse's stethoscope slipped from her trembling fingers, the metal clattering against the rocky ground as she stared at the massive grizzly bear lying motionless beside the creek. The 800-pound giant's chest rose and fell in labored, shallow breaths that seemed too quiet for something so enormous. What she heard through that stethoscope wasn't just one heartbeat, it was three. Ranger Tom Standing Bear stumbled backward, his radio crackling with static as his voice cracked, "Base camp, we're going to need more than a tranquilizer dart." The forest around them had fallen into an unnatural silence, as if every creature within miles had fled from whatever was about to unfold. Sarah's mind raced back to her veterinary training, searching for any explanation that could make sense of the impossible sounds echoing from within the bear's massive frame. 30 years of treating wildlife had never prepared her for this moment. "Call Doctor Martinez now," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "and tell him to bring everything." What was hiding inside this dying bear? And why did it sound like something was trying to get out? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The wind carried the scent of pine and something else, something that made Sarah's stomach clench with recognition. Death, but not the bear's death. Something far more complex lingered in the air around the massive grizzly, a story written in scars across his dark fur and the protective way his massive paws were positioned. Sarah Whitehorse had spent the last 3 years talking more to animals than to people, and she preferred it that way. At 55, the Cherokee American veterinarian carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that healing often hurt before it helped. Her weathered hands, once steady as a surgeon's, now trembled slightly, a reminder of the car accident that had taken her husband, Dr. Marcus Whitehorse, and left her alone to run their failing wildlife rescue center. "Back in my day, we knew every creature had a story to tell," came the gravelly voice of Grandpa Joe Whitehorse, Sarah's 78-year-old father-in-law, as he approached through the underbrush with surprising agility for someone battling early-stage dementia. His traditional Cherokee features were etched with concern as he studied the massive bear. "This one's got more than most." The rescue center they'd built together was drowning in $75,000 of debt, with foreclosure papers sitting on Sarah's kitchen table back home. She'd received the emergency call from Ranger Tom Standing Bear at dawn, knowing she couldn't afford another unpaid rescue mission, yet unable to ignore the urgency in his voice. "Some decisions," Marcus used to say, "weren't made with your head, they were made with your heart." Joe knelt beside the bear with the reverence of someone who remembered when his people believed animals carried souls as precious as any humans. "She's not he," Joe murmured, running experienced eyes over the grizzly's massive frame. "Look at the face, daughter. Look at the way she's positioned herself." Sarah's breath caught as she realized what Joe was seeing. Despite the bear's enormous size, easily 800 pounds, the facial structure, the protective posture, the gentle curve of massive paws shielding something beneath her chest, all pointed to one impossible truth. This wasn't a male grizzly at all. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "Female grizzlies don't grow this large. They can't." "Nature makes exceptions when love demands it," Joe replied with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent decades observing the wilderness. His fingers, gnarled with arthritis but still gentle, reached toward the bear's muzzle. "The question isn't what she is, daughter. The question is what she's protecting." As if responding to Joe's words, a soft, whimpering sound emerged from beneath the grizzly's massive body. Then another. The bear's eyes fluttered open, not with aggression, but with the fierce desperation of a mother who sensed her babies were in danger. "Dear God," Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her as the pieces fell into place. "She's got cubs under there!" The massive grizzly's eyes found Sarah's, and in that moment she saw something that would haunt her forever, a mother's plea for help. The emergency call had come at 6 in the morning, cutting through Sarah's restless sleep like a blade. Ranger Tom. Standing Bear's voice carried an urgency she hadn't heard in his 20 years of service. "Doc, we've got a situation out here that doesn't make sense. Hikers found a grizzly, but it's not acting right. Not aggressive, not running, just lying there like it's waiting for something." Sarah had stared at the foreclosure notice on her kitchen table, the bold red letters spelling out her failure in corporate language. The White Horse Wildlife Rescue Center had exactly 48 hours before the bank claimed everything she and Marcus had built together. Every emergency call now meant choosing between her dwindling savings and her calling as a healer. "I can't afford another unpaid rescue, Tom," she'd whispered into the phone, hating herself for the words even as they left her lips. "This isn't about money, Doc. Something's wrong out here. Real wrong. The whole forest's gone quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Even the insects stopped buzzing. Whatever's happening with this bear, it's got every other creature spooked." Joe had been sitting at the kitchen table, carefully organizing his morning pills, a ritual that helped anchor him when the dementia fog rolled in thick. His clear brown eyes had found hers across the room. "Sometimes you follow your heart, even when your head says no, daughter. That's what my son would have done." The 2-hour hike into Yellowstone's backcountry had been treacherous, made worse by Sarah's aging equipment and the weight of 3 years' worth of grief she carried in her chest like a stone. Joe had insisted on coming, despite his condition, moving through the wilderness with the sure-footedness of someone who had spent decades as a park ranger before retirement. "Marcus always said I had healing hands," Sarah had murmured as they climbed the rocky trail. "Some days I wonder if I lost that gift when I lost him." "Gifts don't disappear, daughter," Joe had replied during one of his moments of clarity. "They just get buried under hurt. Sometimes it takes something bigger than yourself to dig them back up." The forest's unnatural silence had grown more oppressive with each step. Sarah had treated wounded wildlife for 30 years, but she'd never experienced anything like this. Every instinct in her body screaming that they were walking into something beyond her understanding. When they'd finally reached the creek bed, the sight had stopped her cold. The massive grizzly lay on her side, dark fur matted with mud and blood, breathing shallow and labored. But it was the bear's positioning that made Sarah's heart race. One massive paw curved protectively around something, the other stretched out as if creating a barrier. "Easy, girl," Sarah had whispered, approaching with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who understood that trust was earned in inches, not feet. The bear's eyes had tracked her movement, but showed no aggression, only a bone-deep weariness that spoke of battles fought and barely won. The mysterious bulge beneath the bear's chest had risen and fallen with soft, rhythmic breathing that wasn't synchronized with the mother's labored respiration. Sarah's trained eye had caught the subtle signs, the way the bear's body curved protectively, the dried milk stains on her fur, the careful positioning that created a warm, safe space beneath her massive frame. "She's nursing," Sarah had breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "But where's the father? Male grizzlies don't do what she's doing," Joe had interrupted quietly. "Look closer, daughter. Look with your heart, not your eyes." That's when Sarah had seen it. The delicate bone structure beneath the massive muscle, the gentle curve of the muzzle, the way the bear's ears were positioned. Despite her enormous size, despite everything Sarah thought she knew about grizzly bears, this was unmistakably a female. "That's impossible," she'd whispered. "Females don't grow this large." "They can't." The soft whimpering from beneath the bear had answered her disbelief. 2 distinct voices, tiny and desperate, muffled by fur and the protective weight of their adoptive mother. The massive Grizzly had lifted her head slightly, looking directly at Sarah with eyes that held intelligence, desperation, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "She's been waiting for us," Joe had said with quiet certainty. "Waiting for someone who could help." In the distance, the sound of breaking branches had made them all freeze. Someone else was in these woods, moving through the underbrush with the deliberate stealth of a hunter. The bear's ears had pricked forward, and a low rumble had emerged from her throat, not aggression, but warning. Sarah had reached for her emergency radio, her hands shaking as she realized they weren't alone in this remote corner of Yellowstone. Someone else had been tracking this bear family, and from the way the massive mother was tensing despite her injuries, that someone meant trouble. The cubs' crying had grown more urgent, as if they too sensed the approaching danger. The figure emerged from the tree line like a shadow given substance, rifle cradled in arms that spoke of military training and bitter purpose. Jake Brennan moved with the calculated precision of someone who had spent months tracking his prey, his weathered face carved with lines of grief that had hardened into something darker. "Step away from the bear, Doc." Jake's voice carried the flat authority of a man who had made peace with violence. At 45, the former park maintenance worker had transformed himself into something the wilderness feared, a hunter driven by demons that no amount of killing could silence. "That thing and her spawn are coming with me." Sarah positioned herself between Jake and the massive Grizzly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "She's injured and nursing. You can't just—" "Can't?" Jake's laugh held no humor, only the bitter edge of a man who had lost everything that mattered. "I've got permits, Doc. Legal ones. Been tracking this killer for 6 months, and today she stops running." He raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at Sarah, but making his intentions clear. "Move aside, or I'll move you." The massive Grizzly, who Sarah now realized had to be called by name, not just species, struggled to lift her head. Despite her size and obvious strength, she was clearly weakened by whatever injuries she carried. The cubs beneath her protested with tiny, mewing sounds as their shelter shifted. "Her name's Thor," Jake continued, his voice taking on the obsessive quality of someone who had rehearsed this confrontation countless times. "Least, that's what the locals called her before she started her killing spree. Biggest female grizzly anyone's ever documented, and the most dangerous." Joe stepped forward, his aged frame placing itself between his daughter-in-law and the rifle. Despite the early-stage dementia that clouded his thoughts more often each day, his voice carried the clear authority of someone speaking fundamental truth. "That bear's not a killer, son. She's a mother." "A mother?" Jake's voice cracked with pain that had been festering for years. "You want to talk about mothers? My boy Tommy was 12 years old. 12. He died because of bears like this one. Died trying to save something that would have killed him without a second thought." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She could see it now. The way Jake's hands trembled slightly despite their steady grip on the weapon. The haunted look in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and waking nightmares. This wasn't about hunting or permits or even money. This was about a father's grief turned toxic. "Tell me about Tommy," Sarah said quietly, recognizing the desperate need in Jake's voice to be heard, to make someone understand the magnitude of his loss. Jake's composure cracked for just a moment. "He was everything good in this world, Doc. Smart as a whip, kind to every living thing he met, always bringing home wounded birds, trying to nurse sick raccoons back to health. Said he wanted to be a veterinarian like you someday." His voice dropped to a whisper. 5 years ago, he was trying to save bear cubs that had fallen through thin ice. Water was so cold. By the time I found him, the massive Grizzly beneath their conversation made a soft sound, not a growl, but something almost like recognition. Her massive head turned toward Jake, and for a moment something passed between them that made Sarah's breath catch. She knows you, Joe said quietly. Don't she, son? Jake's rifle wavered slightly. She was there, watching from the shore while my boy died in that freezing water, watching while I pulled his body out, watching while I tried to breathe life back into lungs that would never fill again. And you know what she did? Nothing. Just watched my world end. Maybe, Joe said with the gentle wisdom of someone who had seen enough grief to recognize its many faces. She was watching over something, too. The cubs beneath Thor chose that moment to emerge slightly, two tiny faces peering out from their shelter with the fearless curiosity of babies who had never learned to fear the world. They were clearly malnourished, their fur patchy with stress, but alive and alert. Sarah's veterinary training kicked in as she studied them. They're not hers, she breathed. Look at the coloring, the size. These cubs are at least 6 months old, but their bone structure is all wrong for Thor's offspring. What are you saying? Jake demanded, but his voice had lost some of its harsh certainty. I'm saying she adopted them, Sarah replied, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Something happened to their biological mother, and Thor took them in. Female grizzlies don't usually do that, especially not with cubs this size, but sometimes. She looked at Joe, remembering his earlier words about nature making exceptions. Sometimes love makes us bigger than we thought we could be, Joe finished quietly. Jake's rifle lowered another inch as he stared at the cubs. You're telling me this bear, the same bear that watched my son die, is playing foster mother to orphans? Thor made another soft sound, and one of the cubs nuzzled against her massive paw. The gesture was so tender, so unmistakably maternal, that even Jake seemed affected by it. Maybe, Sarah said carefully. She understood what your Tommy was trying to do better than anyone realized. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Jake had built his grief upon, and for the first time since emerging from the woods, his certainty began to crack. The standoff stretched across the creek bed like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Jake's rifle remained lowered, but not lowered enough, his internal war playing out across features carved by 5 years of misdirected rage. Thor's breathing had grown more labored, each rise and fall of her massive chest a reminder that time was running out for all of them. You don't understand, Jake said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose entire world view was crumbling. I've been hunting bears for 5 years. 5 years of tracking, of learning their habits, of making them pay for what they took from me. And this one, he gestured toward Thor with the barrel of his rifle. This one's been the worst. She's smart, Doc. Smarter than any bear has a right to be. She's evaded every trap, outsmarted every hunter, led us on chases that ended with good men getting hurt. Sarah knelt slowly beside Thor, her veterinary instincts overriding her fear as she began a preliminary examination. What she found made her heart sink. She's got deep lacerations along her flank, she reported, her hands finding the source of the blood, matting the bear's fur. Looks like bullet grazes, maybe from a high-powered rifle. These wounds are infected, probably a week old. That's my handiwork, Jake admitted without shame. Been tracking her family for months. Got close enough last week to take a shot. But she did something I've never seen before. Instead of running or attacking, she positioned herself between me and the cubs, took the bullets meant for them. Joe's weathered hand found Sarah's shoulder as she continued her examination. During his lucid moments, her father-in-law possessed an almost supernatural ability to read both animals and people. She's been carrying more than cubs, daughter. Look at her paws. Sarah followed Joe's gaze and gasped. Thor's massive paws were worn raw, the pads cracked and bleeding from what must have been weeks of constant travel over rough terrain. She's been walking for miles, Sarah breathed. Days, maybe weeks. But why? Because someone's been chasing her, Jake answered, his voice carrying an odd note of what might have been respect. Every time we got close, she moved those cubs to a new den. Never left them behind, never let them slow her down, just kept moving, kept protecting. The cubs, growing bolder now that the immediate threat seemed to have diminished, emerged more fully from their shelter beneath Thor's body. Sarah's trained eye immediately cataloged their condition: malnourished but not starving, dehydrated but alert, traumatized but not broken. Most tellingly, they showed no fear of humans, suggesting they had been around people before. "Jake," Sarah said slowly, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. "Where exactly did you first encounter this bear family?" "About 30 miles north of here, near Cascade Creek. There's an old fishing spot where—" Jake's voice trailed off, his face going pale as the implication of Sarah's question hit him. "You think these are the same cubs? The ones Tommy died trying to save?" Joe nodded gravely. "Bears remember, son. They remember kindness, and they remember cruelty. If these are the cubs your boy tried to save, she's been caring for them all this time." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sounds of the cubs and Thor's labored breathing. Jake stood frozen, his rifle now hanging loosely at his side as the pieces of a puzzle he'd never wanted to solve began clicking into place. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Bear cubs don't survive without their mother." "Tommy died because it was hopeless from the start." "Usually you'd be right," Sarah agreed gently. "But sometimes, when the unthinkable happens, nature finds a way. Thor isn't just any bear, Jake. Look at her size, her intelligence, her protective instincts. She's extraordinary." As if responding to the conversation about her, Thor made a tremendous effort to lift her head fully. Her eyes, clouded with pain but still alert, found Jake's face and held his gaze. What passed between them in that moment was something Sarah would never be able to fully explain. A communication that transcended species and spoke directly to the raw grief both of them carried. "She knows," Jake breathed. "She knows who I am." "Of course she does," Joe said quietly. "She was there when you lost your boy. She saw your pain, just like you saw hers when she lost their mother." "Grief recognizes grief, son, even across the divide between human and animal." Jake's rifle slipped from his hands, clattering against the rocks as he sank to his knees. 5 years of carefully constructed hatred crumbled in the space of a heartbeat, leaving behind only the raw, unprocessed grief of a father who had lost everything that mattered. "What have I done?" he whispered. "God, what have I done?" But their moment of revelation was shattered by the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines, heavy and fast, cutting through the wilderness with mechanical brutality. Sarah's emergency radio crackled to life with a voice she didn't recognize. "Dr. Whitehorse, this is Frank Morrison. I believe you have something that belongs to my associate, Mr. Brennan. We're here to collect it." Jake's head snapped up, fear replacing grief in his eyes. "Frank, how did he—" Jake scrambled for his radio. "Frank, stay back." "The situation's changed here." "Oh, I don't think so, Jake," came the reply, cold and professional. "You've been radio silent for 3 hours. Contract says if you can't deliver, we step in. And we always deliver." "Contract?" Sarah demanded, her blood running cold. "Jake, what contract?" Jake's face was ashen as the truth spilled out. "I couldn't afford to keep hunting on my own. Medical bills from my wife's cancer treatment, the farm's in foreclosure. Frank Morrison's outfit offered me $25,000 for Thor, $15,000 for each cub. Said they had collectors who'd pay premium for bears this rare." "Collectors?" Joe's voice carried the horrified understanding of someone who knew exactly what that meant. "You mean people who killed for trophies?" "I thought it was just about the money," Jake protested desperately. "I thought if I could make them pay, make someone profit from their death instead of them causing more death, it would feel like justice. But seeing her like this, seeing what she's done for those cubs—" The sound of the approaching vehicles grew louder, and Thor's maternal instincts kicked into overdrive despite her weakened condition. She struggled to push herself upright, positioning her massive body between the cubs and the direction of the approaching threat. "How many men is Frank bringing?" Sarah asked urgently. "3 trucks, maybe 12 men, all armed," Jake replied miserably. "They're professionals, Doc. Military backgrounds, high-end equipment. They don't take no for an answer." Sarah's mind raced through impossible calculations. Thor was too weak to run, the cubs too young to move fast over rough terrain, and they were at least 2 hours from the nearest road where help might reach them. Her emergency radio had been silent, no response from park rangers or wildlife authorities. "We need to move her," Sarah decided. "Get her and the cubs to the rescue center where we have proper medical facilities and legal protection." "She can't travel in her condition," Joe pointed out gently. "And even if she could, Frank's team will catch us long before we reach safety." Jake stood slowly, his earlier anger replaced by something Sarah recognized as determination. "Not if someone delays them." "Jake, no," Sarah protested. "You can't take on 12 armed men alone." "I can't," Jake agreed. "But I know these woods better than they do. And I know Frank's weaknesses. He's good at tracking in open country, but he's never learned to read the forest like a local." The cubs had begun making distressed sounds as Thor's agitation increased. Their tiny voices carried across the creek bed, a sound that seemed to strengthen Thor's resolve even as her body weakened further. "There's something else," Jake said quietly. "Something I never told anyone about the day Tommy died." He didn't just fall through the ice trying to save random cubs. He'd been feeding them for weeks, coming out here every day after school with his lunch, trying to keep them alive after their mother was killed by poachers. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Your son was trying to save these exact cubs?" "Tommy left a journal," Jake continued, his voice breaking. "Found it after the funeral. He'd named them, called the smaller one Little Star and the bigger one Moonwalker. Said they trusted him, that he was all they had left in the world." Thor made a soft sound at the mention of the names, and both cubs immediately responded, looking up at Jake with sudden recognition. The moment was so profound, so impossible to explain through any scientific understanding Sarah possessed, that she felt tears streaming down her face. "They remember him," she whispered. After 5 years, they remember Tommy. The sound of vehicles had grown close enough that they could hear doors slamming, men shouting orders, equipment being unloaded. Frank Morrison's team was less than a quarter-mile away and closing fast. "Doc," Jake said urgently, "I need you to promise me something. Whatever happens here, you make sure those cubs grow up safe. Make sure Tommy's sacrifice meant something." Before Sarah could respond, Jake had retrieved his rifle and was moving toward the sound of the approaching hunters, leaving her alone with Joe, Thor, and the 2 cubs that had somehow survived 5 years in the wilderness thanks to the love of a boy who died trying to save them and a bear who had made their survival her life's mission. The gunfire echoed through the canyon like thunder, sharp cracks that sent every remaining bird in the forest into panicked flight. Sarah pressed herself against the rocky outcropping where she'd managed to drag Thor and the cubs, her heart hammering as she listened to the battle raging less than half a mile away. Jake's voice could be heard shouting warnings, followed by the angry responses of Frank Morrison's team. "Jake's buying us time," Joe said quietly, his weathered hands surprisingly steady as he helped Sarah prepare an emergency medical kit. Despite his dementia, crisis seemed to sharpen his focus, bringing back decades of ranger training. "But not much. We need to get them moving." Thor's condition had deteriorated rapidly. The stress of the confrontation and the effort to protect the cubs had reopened her infected wounds, and fresh blood was seeping through the matted fur on her flank. Her breathing had become even more labored, each breath a monumental effort that made Sarah's chest tighten with helplessness. "She's going into shock," Sarah diagnosed, checking Thor's pulse and finding it rapid and thready. Internal bleeding, infection, exhaustion. Her body's shutting down. She looked at the cubs, who were pressed against their adoptive mother's side, instinctively seeking comfort from the only parent they'd ever really known. "I don't think she's going to make it to the rescue center." Little Star, the smaller of the two cubs, began making soft, distressed sounds that cut through Sarah's professional composure like a knife. The tiny bear seemed to understand that something was terribly wrong with the massive female who had been her world for the past 5 years. Moonwalker, slightly larger and braver, nudged Thor's massive head with his small nose, trying to elicit a response. "You remember them, don't you, girl?" Joe whispered to Thor, settling beside her massive head with the gentle confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime communicating with wildlife. "You remember the boy who tried to save them? You've been keeping his promise all this time." Thor's eyes fluttered open at Joe's voice, and she made a tremendous effort to lift her head toward the cubs. What happened next defied every piece of scientific knowledge Sarah possessed about bear behavior. Thor began making soft vocalizations, not growls or roars, but gentle huffing sounds that were unmistakably maternal. The cubs responded immediately, pressing closer to her and making answering sounds that spoke of a bond deeper than biology. "She's saying goodbye," Sarah realized, her voice thick with tears she couldn't control. "She knows she's dying, and she's trying to comfort them." The gunfire had grown more sporadic, punctuated by shouted commands and the sound of men crashing through underbrush. Jake's delaying tactics were clearly working, but Sarah could tell from the direction of the sounds that Frank's team was systematically searching the area, getting closer to their hiding spot with each passing minute. "Dr. Whitehorse!" Frank Morrison's voice echoed across the canyon, amplified by a megaphone. "We know you're out here with our merchandise. Jake Brennan's contract is void as of right now, but we're prepared to offer you compensation for your trouble. 20,000 cash for the adult, 10 for each cub. Think about it. That's enough to save your rescue center." Sarah's blood ran cold. Frank knew about her financial situation, which meant he'd done his homework. Professional poachers didn't operate on impulse. They planned, researched, and exploited every weakness they could find. "How does he know about the foreclosure?" she whispered to Joe. "Men like that make it their business to know things," Joe replied grimly. "They're predators, daughter. They can smell desperation from miles away." Thor made another tremendous effort, this time managing to lift her massive paw and place it gently over the cubs. The gesture was so clearly protective, so profoundly maternal, that even Joe wiped his eyes. Despite her pain, despite her weakness, her final thoughts were for the babies she had raised as her own. 40,000! Frank's voice boomed across the wilderness. "That's more money than your rescue center sees in 2 years, Doc. All you have to do is walk away." Sarah felt the weight of the decision crushing down on her. $40,000 would save the rescue center, would allow her to continue the work she and Marcus had started, would help countless other animals in the years to come. Against that stood one dying bear and 2 cubs who would face a horrible death at the hands of trophy hunters. "What would Marcus do?" she whispered, more to herself than to Joe. "You already know, daughter," Joe replied softly. "Same thing his daddy taught him, same thing I taught you. Some things can't be bought, and some promises can't be broken." The cubs had begun making increasingly distressed sounds as Thor's breathing became more irregular. They could sense that their world was ending, and their tiny voices carried all the heartbreak of children who had lost too much already. 50,000, Frank shouted, his voice now carrying an edge of frustration. Final offer, Doc. After this, we take what we came for, and you get nothing but trouble. Sarah closed her eyes and made her choice. Opening her emergency veterinary kit, she began preparing a powerful stimulant that might give Thor the strength for one last effort. It was dangerous. In her weakened condition, the drug could kill her, but doing nothing would certainly mean death for all three bears. "What are you doing?" Joe asked. "Giving her a fighting chance," Sarah replied, filling a syringe with steady hands despite the chaos around them. "This will either give her enough strength to move or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. As Sarah prepared to administer the injection, Thor's eyes found hers. In that moment of connection, Sarah saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Trust. Complete, unwavering trust from a creature who had every reason to fear humans, who had been hunted and wounded by humans, but who somehow recognized in Sarah a kindred spirit. "I won't let them take your babies," Sarah whispered to Thor. "I promise." She administered the injection just as the sound of approaching footsteps grew dangerously close. Within seconds, Thor's eyes sharpened, her breathing stabilized, and she began the monumental effort of rising to her feet. The transformation was miraculous but temporary. Sarah knew the stimulant would only last for minutes before Thor's body crashed harder than before. "Time to move," Joe said urgently, gathering the cubs in his arms with surprising strength. "That shot won't last long." Thor, now standing despite her injuries, towered over them like a furry mountain. Even weakened, even dying, she was magnificent. 800 pounds of muscle and maternal determination. She looked down at the cubs in Joe's arms, then at Sarah, and something passed between them that needed no translation. Frank Morrison emerged from the tree line with 2 armed men, all carrying high-powered rifles and wearing military-style tactical gear. His face was hard and professional, but his eyes lit up when he saw Thor standing in the clearing. "There she is," Frank breathed, raising his rifle. "The famous Thor? Do you know how much money you've cost me over the years, you smart old girl?" "Don't!" Sarah stepped between Frank and the bears, her arms spread wide. "She's dying anyway. The cubs are orphans. They've never hurt anyone." "Lady, those cubs will grow up to be killers just like Mama there," Frank replied coldly. "We're doing the world a favor." He gestured to his men. "Trank the big one, nets for the babies. Let's finish this." That's when Jake Brennan appeared at the edge of the clearing, his clothes torn and bloody, but his rifle steady. Behind him came 2 more figures, Frank's remaining team members, but something was wrong. They were walking with their hands raised, their weapons lowered. "Frank!" Jake called out, his voice carrying an authority Sarah hadn't heard before. "Meet Billy Red Hawk and Tom Standing Bear, both undercover federal wildlife agents who've been tracking your operation for 6 months. Frank's face went white as the implications hit him. His carefully planned operation had been compromised from the inside, and now he was facing federal charges instead of an easy payday. "You set me up," Frank snarled at Jake. "No," Jake replied quietly. "I set myself up. Been working with the feds for 3 months now, trying to make up for what I've done. Today was supposed to be the final sting operation." But Frank Morrison hadn't survived years of illegal hunting by giving up easily. With desperate fury, he swung his rifle toward Thor and the cubs, his finger tightening on the trigger. That's when Thor, using the last of her stimulant-enhanced strength, charged. The world exploded into chaos as Thor's massive form hurtled across the clearing with the last reserves of her failing strength. 800 pounds of maternal fury and desperation crashed into Frank Morrison before he could complete his shot, sending both of them tumbling into the rocky creek bed in a tangle of fur, fabric, and flailing limbs. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air, its sharp crack echoing off the canyon walls like a death knell. Frank's scream of terror was cut short as he hit the water hard, Thor's massive body pinning him against the rocky bottom. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The only sounds were the splash of displaced water and the ragged breathing of everyone watching the scene unfold. Sarah's heart stopped as she realized what Thor's desperate charge had cost her. The massive bear lay motionless in the shallow water, her labored breathing now barely perceptible. The stimulant had burned through her system like wildfire, leaving her body with nothing left to give. Dark blood seeped from her reopened wounds, mixing with the creek water in crimson swirls that spoke of a life ebbing away. "Thor!" Little Star's tiny voice cut through the shocked silence, a sound so heartbroken and desperate that it made every human present flinch. The small cub struggled in Joe's arms, trying to reach the only mother she had ever known. Frank Morrison emerged from the water, gasping and sputtering, his expensive tactical gear soaked and his professional composure shattered. Federal agents Billy Red Hawk and Tom Standing Bear were on him immediately, weapons drawn and voices sharp with authority. "Frank Morrison, you're under arrest for violation of the Endangered Species Act, conspiracy to commit wildlife trafficking, and assault with a deadly weapon," Billy announced, his Cherokee features set in grim satisfaction. "You have the right to remain silent." But Sarah wasn't listening to the arrest. She was wading into the creek toward Thor, her veterinary training overriding every other consideration. The massive bear's eyes were open but unfocused, her breathing shallow and irregular. Sarah knelt in the cold water beside her, placing her hands on Thor's massive head. "It's okay, girl," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with grief and admiration. "You did it. You saved them. You saved your babies." Thor's eyes found Sarah's face one last time, and in that moment of connection, Sarah saw something that would change her forever. Not just the intelligence she'd always known animals possessed, but something deeper: gratitude, peace, and a love so profound it transcended every boundary between species. Moonwalker had joined his sister in crying for their mother, their tiny voices creating a chorus of loss that echoed across the water. Joe, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, carried both cubs to the edge of the creek where they could see Thor but remained safe from the deeper water. "She's not going to make it," Sarah said quietly, her professional assessment cutting through her emotional response like a knife. Thor's pulse was fading, her body temperature dropping rapidly. Even if they could get her to a fully equipped veterinary hospital, the damage was too extensive, the blood loss too severe. Jake knelt on the opposite side of Thor from Sarah, his face transformed by a grief so raw it was painful to witness. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the dying bear. "God, I'm so sorry. You were just protecting them, just like Tommy was trying to do. I should have seen it. I should have understood." Thor's massive paw twitched slightly, and Jake reached out instinctively to touch it. The gesture was so gentle, so different from the hatred he'd carried for 5 years, that it seemed to bridge the impossible gap between predator and prey, between the species that had taken his son and the father who had spent years seeking revenge. "She forgives you," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle communications between humans and animals. "Look at her eyes, son. She knows you understand now." The federal agents had Frank and his remaining team secured, but the victory felt hollow in the face of Thor's sacrifice. Sarah continued to stroke the massive bear's head, feeling the life gradually ebbing away beneath her hands. "What happens to the cubs?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse with grief and guilt. "They come home with me," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "The rescue center might be going into foreclosure, but I'll find a way. They'll have a home for as long as they need one." Thor's breathing became even more labored, each breath a monumental effort, but her eyes remained fixed on the cubs, watching them with the fierce attention of a mother who knew she was seeing her children for the last time. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thor closed her eyes for the final time. Her last breath came out as a soft sigh that seemed to carry all the love and sacrifice of the past 5 years. The cubs' crying intensified, their tiny voices calling for a mother who would never answer again. 3 days after Thor's death, Sarah sat in the cramped office of her failing rescue center, staring at documents that would change everything she thought she knew about love, sacrifice, and the impossible bonds that could form between species. The manila envelope had arrived that morning via federal courier, marked "Evidence, Tommy Brennan Case File," and signed by Agent Billy Redhawk. Inside were photocopies of a child's journal, pages filled with careful handwriting in blue ink, and small sketches of bear cubs. The final entry was dated exactly 5 years ago, the day before Tommy Brennan died trying to save 2 orphaned bear cubs from drowning in Cascade Creek. "March 15th, Sarah read aloud to Joe, who sat beside her holding Little Star while Moonwalker slept in a makeshift den they'd constructed from blankets and heating pads. "The mama bear hasn't come back for 3 days now. I think something bad happened to her. The babies are getting really skinny and they cry all the time. Dad would be mad if he knew I was coming out here, but I can't just let them die. They trust me now. They come when I call their names." Sarah's voice broke as she continued reading. "I named the little girl Little Star because she has a white patch on her forehead that looks like a star. The boy is Moonwalker because he always wants to explore at night. They're so smart, way smarter than people think bears are. They remember things, and they know when I'm sad about Mom being sick." Joe's weathered hand found Sarah's shoulder as she struggled to compose herself. In his arms, Little Star made soft sounds that seemed almost like she was responding to the mention of her name. The white patch on her forehead, barely visible as a cub but now clearly defined, marked her unmistakably as the same bear Tommy had tried to save. "There's more," Sarah whispered, turning to the final pages. "March 20th. Tomorrow I'm going to try to catch them and bring them somewhere safe. I looked up wildlife rescue places online, and there's one run by Dr. Whitehorse about 50 miles from here. She specializes in orphaned animals. If I can get Little Star and Moonwalker to her, maybe they'll have a real chance." The journal entry continued with the careful planning of a 12-year-old boy who understood he was undertaking something dangerous but necessary. Tommy had researched bear behavior, studied maps of the area, and even calculated the safest route to transport frightened cubs. His final words were a prayer. "God, please help me save them. They don't deserve to die just because they're alone." "He never got the chance to bring them to us," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "He died the next day trying to rescue them from the ice." But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Agent Redhawk had included security footage from the day of Tommy's death, grainy black and white images from a trail camera that had captured the entire tragedy. Sarah watched in stunned silence as the footage showed Tommy approaching the frozen creek where the cubs had fallen through thin ice. What she saw next defied everything she thought she knew about the story. Tommy hadn't died trying to rescue the cubs from drowning. He had successfully pulled both Little Star and Moonwalker from the freezing water using a makeshift rope and pulley system he'd constructed from materials in his backpack. The cubs were safe on shore, warming themselves against Tommy's jacket, when the real tragedy occurred. The ice beneath Tommy gave way just as he was climbing out of the water himself, but instead of thrashing in panic, the footage showed something extraordinary. Tommy had carefully pushed his backpack, containing emergency food supplies he'd brought for the cubs, toward shore before he disappeared beneath the ice. His final act wasn't one of desperate self-preservation, but of ensuring the cubs would have what they needed to survive until help arrived. "He saved them," Sarah breathed, watching the grainy footage replay. "Tommy actually saved them. They were alive and safe when he died." The footage continued, showing what happened in the hours after Tommy's death. Jake arrived with the search and rescue team, finding his son's body but not immediately noticing the two small bear cubs huddled in the nearby brush. It was only when the recovery team was preparing to leave that a massive female grizzly appeared at the edge of the clearing. Thor's first appearance on camera was nothing like the aggressive predator Jake had described in his years of hunting stories. She approached the cubs slowly, cautiously, making soft vocalizations that seemed designed to comfort rather than frighten. The cubs, recognizing something maternal in her presence, had approached her willingly. "She heard them crying," Joe said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "A mother always knows when babies need help, even if they're not her own babies." The final frames of the footage showed Thor gently gathering the cubs, leading them away from the scene of tragedy into the wilderness where she would care for them for the next 5 years. She had appeared in Tommy's final hour not as a threat, but as an answer to his prayer. Sarah closed the file and sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what she'd learned. Every assumption about the relationship between Thor, the cubs, and Tommy's death had been wrong. Thor hadn't watched a child die. She had honored his sacrifice by dedicating her life to the cubs he'd saved. "Jake needs to see this," Sarah said finally. "He deserves to know the truth about what his son accomplished." Jake arrived at the rescue center that evening, his face bearing the weight of 5 years of misdirected grief and 3 days of devastating revelation. When Sarah showed him the journal entries and the security footage, he collapsed into a chair and wept with the raw abandon of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered and rebuilt. "My boy saved them," he kept repeating, his voice broken with awe and regret. "All these years I thought he died for nothing, but he saved them. And Thor, God, Thor spent 5 years finishing what Tommy started." The cubs, as if sensing the importance of the moment, approached Jake cautiously. Little Star, bolder than her brother, placed a tiny paw on Jake's knee and looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold recognition and forgiveness. "They remember you," Sarah said softly. "Not as the man who hunted them, but as Tommy's father. They know you're part of their story." Jake reached out with trembling hands to gently stroke Little Star's fur. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to both cubs. "I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I let my grief make me into something Tommy would have been ashamed of." The financial crisis that had threatened to close the rescue center was resolved through channels Sarah could never have anticipated. The federal case against Frank Morrison had attracted national media attention, and the story of Thor's sacrifice and Tommy's heroism had gone viral on social media platforms across the country. Donations poured in from around the world, not just enough to save the facility, but to expand it into a premier wildlife rescue and education center. Jake's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire ordeal. The man who had spent 5 years hunting bears became their most passionate advocate, using his knowledge of their behavior to help with rehabilitation efforts and his personal story to educate others about the complex relationships between humans and wildlife. "Tommy would have been 17 now," Jake said one evening as he helped Sarah feed the cubs. "Old enough to work here, probably planning to study veterinary medicine in college. In a way, watching these two grow up is like getting to see a piece of him continue on. The cubs thrived under the combined care of Sarah, Joe, and their unlikely protector, Jake. They grew strong and healthy, displaying the intelligence and gentle nature that Tommy had recognized in them 5 years earlier. But they also carried something else, a legacy of love that transcended species boundaries and connected them to a boy who had died to save them, and a bear who had lived to honor his sacrifice. As autumn approached and the cubs prepared for their first winter in captivity, Sarah often found herself standing at the edge of their enclosure, watching them play and thinking about the invisible threads that connected all their lives. Tommy's love for the cubs had led to Thor's adoption of them, which had led to Jake's transformation, which had led to Sarah's renewed purpose and the rescue center's salvation. In the end, it was love that had saved them all. 1 year later, the White Horse Wildlife Rescue Center had transformed into something neither Sarah nor Marcus could have imagined when they first dreamed of creating a sanctuary for injured animals. The sprawling facility now covered 50 acres of pristine Montana wilderness, complete with natural habitat enclosures, a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, and an education center that welcomed thousands of visitors each year. The dedication ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Thor's death and 5 years to the day since Tommy Brennan's heroic sacrifice. A bronze statue stood at the center of the new education center, a life-size sculpture of a massive bear protectively curved around two small cubs with a plaque that read, "In memory of Thor and in honor of Tommy Brennan, who taught us that love knows no boundaries." Sarah stood before the gathered crowd, her silver hair catching the autumn sunlight as she prepared to speak at the ceremony. Beside her, Jake held a photograph of his son, while Joe sat in his wheelchair, his dementia progression slowed by the purpose and joy that caring for the cubs had brought to his final years. "Today we celebrate more than just a building or a program," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled visitors. "We celebrate the truth that love, real, unconditional love, has the power to transform tragedy into triumph, hatred into healing, and loss into legacy." In the crowd, she could see faces that had become part of their extended family over the past year. Agent Billy Redhawk had become a regular volunteer, using his law enforcement connections to help combat wildlife trafficking throughout the region. Tom Standing Bear had taken early retirement from the Park Service to work full-time at the center, bringing decades of wilderness expertise to their conservation efforts. Even Frank Morrison's former associate, Billy Redhawk's cousin, who had been caught up in the illegal hunting operation, had found redemption through community service at the center. Watching him gently feed orphaned raccoons, Sarah often marveled at the capacity for change that existed in every human heart when given the chance. But the true stars of the ceremony were Little Star and Moonwalker, now full-grown adolescent bears who had become ambassadors for their species. At 18 months old, they were magnificent examples of healthy, well-socialized bears who had never lost their gentle nature despite their tragic early experiences. "Some people ask me whether we should have released them into the wild," Sarah continued, watching the bears play in their expansive enclosure. "But Little Star and Moonwalker serve a greater purpose here. They teach thousands of visitors each year that bears are not monsters to be feared, but intelligent, complex creatures deserving of our respect and protection." Jake stepped forward to address the crowd, his transformation from bitter hunter to passionate conservationist, serving as living proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to face their mistakes and choose a different path. "5 years ago, I lost my son to a tragic accident," Jake said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "In my grief and anger, I blamed the wrong parties and spent years seeking revenge that would have dishonored everything Tommy stood for. It took a dying bear's final act of love to show me the truth, that my son died a hero, and his legacy lived on in the very creatures I had been trying to destroy. The crowd was silent as Jake continued, many dabbing at their eyes with tissues. Tommy's dream was to become a veterinarian, to dedicate his life to helping animals in need. Through this center, through the work we do here every day, that dream lives on. Every animal we save, every young person we inspire to care about conservation, every mind we change about the value of wildlife, it's all part of Tommy's continuing impact on the world. Joe, despite his increasing frailty, had insisted on speaking at the ceremony. Sarah helped him to the microphone where he shared the Cherokee wisdom that had guided their journey. "My people have always known that all life is connected," Joe said, his voice still strong despite his physical decline. "The bear and the human, the predator and the prey, the living and the dead, we are all part of the same great circle." Thor understood this. She knew that saving those cubs meant saving a piece of the boy who had tried to protect them. Love like that doesn't die with the body. It lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of protection, every choice to help rather than harm. As the formal ceremony concluded, visitors were invited to tour the facility and observe the bears in their natural habitat enclosure. Children pressed against the viewing windows, their faces lighting up with wonder as they watched Little Star and Moonwalker play in the pond that had been constructed as part of their habitat. "Are they happy?" a young girl asked Sarah, her small hand pressed against the glass as she watched the bears swimming together. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah replied, kneeling down to the child's level. "They're very happy. They have everything they need. Good food, clean water, medical care, and most importantly, they have each other. Sometimes the best family isn't the one you're born into, but the one that chooses to love you." That evening, after the last visitor had departed and the center had settled into its peaceful nighttime routine, Sarah found herself alone at the memorial statue. The bronze figures seemed to glow in the moonlight, capturing forever the moment when a massive bear had chosen love over fear, protection over self-preservation. Jake appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee in the chilly air. They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 people whose lives had been forever changed by the intersecting paths of love, loss, and redemption. "Do you think Tommy knows?" Jake asked quietly. "Do you think he knows what his sacrifice accomplished?" Sarah smiled, watching as Little Star and Moonwalker settled down for the night in their den, still curled together just as they had been as frightened cubs beneath Thor's protective embrace. "I think love like that never really dies," she replied. "It just keeps growing, touching new lives, creating new connections. Tommy's love saved those cubs. Thor's love raised them. And now their story is inspiring thousands of people to care about conservation. That's immortality, Jake. That's how love conquers death." In the distance, the soft sounds of the bears settling for sleep drifted across the sanctuary, a peaceful ending to another day in the place where tragedy had been transformed into hope, where enemies had become family, and where the love of a brave boy and a magnificent bear would continue touching lives for generations to come. In a world that often feels divided and harsh, this story reminds us that love truly has no boundaries. Not between species, not between strangers, and certainly not between broken hearts seeking healing. For those of us who have experienced loss, watched our children grow and leave, or faced the twilight years wondering if our lives mattered, Thor and Tommy's story offers profound hope. Sometimes our greatest purpose isn't found in grand gestures, but in quiet acts of protection and care. Sarah discovered that family isn't always about blood. It's about choosing to love unconditionally, even when it costs us everything. Jake learned that grief can either destroy us or transform us into something better than we ever imagined. At 55, 60, or beyond, we're not too old to find new purpose, heal old wounds, or create meaningful connections that transcend our differences. This sanctuary became more than a rescue center. It became proof that second chances exist for everyone willing to open their hearts. The greatest legacy we can leave isn't measured in wealth or achievements, but in the love we give and the lives we touch along the way. What moment in your life taught you that love could overcome seemingly impossible odds? Have you ever found unexpected family or purpose later in life that surprised you? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.